His surveillance with Inspector Wilkinson was his first in his new status, so deference to superior experience was clearly in order. But Hughes didn't plan that the situation should stay that way for long. This job with the Met was going to be a new start for him. He had abandoned the girlfriend he had been living with for the previous 4 years. He didn't want any hangovers from his Sheffield life to slow down the advance of his career in London. Hughes was a bright, ambitious young man, and he was in a hurry to have his brightness recognised and his ambition realised. "Oh no, softly, softly, catchy monkey," the inspector went on. "When you've been in the police force as long as I have, you'll find that's the only method that really pays off in the long term. Though I dare say at times to a youngster like you that approach could seem pretty boring." "Yes," said Sergeant Hughes, with rather more feeling than on the previous occasions. They had been sitting for 4 hours watching Chastain Varley. So far, all they had seen had been the arrival and departure of the limo and the arrival of the Porsche. To compound the pointlessness of the exercise, at the moment of Mrs. Pargeter's emergence from Gary's limousine, Inspector Wilkinson had had his binoculars lowered while he pontificated about the number of years it took to make a good copper and how there were no shortcuts possible in the process. Since he had also managed to miss her coming out of the mansion, Wilkinson had no idea what Veronica Chastain's visitor looked like. It was only at the insistence of Sergeant Hughes that they had made a note of the limousine's registration number. To add to the serious doubts he was beginning to entertain about his superior's competence, Hughes, a non-smoker and something of a fitness fanatic, was not enjoying the acrid fug that had been building up in the car. He knew that when he took them off in his flat that evening, his clothes would still smell of tobacco smoke. Inspector Wilkinson's ruminative monologue continued. "No, you have to plan, look ahead, build up your case slowly, and then, when everything's ready, double-checked and sorted, you have to move in like lightning." "Yes," said Sergeant Hughes, who by now had an instinct for the length of pause that required filling. His boss nodded thoughtfully. Inspector Wilkinson was a large, craggy man, only a few years off retirement. He had all the standard accoutrements for someone in his position: a divorce and a variety of subsequent messy relationships, an expression of permanent disappointment, a thin grey moustache, and an antagonistic attitude to his immediate superior, whom he regarded as a jumped-up, university-educated, pen-pushing desk driver. Wilkinson was not close to any of his professional colleagues. He had always hoped that at some stage in his career he would be paired up on a regular basis with a congenial young copper with whom he could build up an ongoing, mutually insulting but ultimately affectionate relationship. However, it hadn't happened yet, and from what he had seen of his latest sidekick, wasn't about to happen. Wilkinson had been an inspector for longer than most people at the station could remember. He had been passed over so often for higher promotions that now he no longer even bothered to fill in the application forms. But that did not mean he was without ambition. Once before in his career, he had been very close to making a major coup, bringing an entire criminal network to justice. For logistical reasons, things hadn't worked out on that occasion, but now he felt he was close to another triumph on a comparable scale, and this time nothing was going to screw it up. Inspector Wilkinson looked at his watch. Like all his movements, the raising of his arm, the turn of his wrist to show the time, was slow and deliberate. Sergeant Hughes already knew that if the two of them had to spend a lot of time together, he would very quickly get infuriated by these slow, deliberate movements. "Another 42 minutes, and we can have another cup of coffee from the thermos," said Inspector Wilkinson. Then, generously, "You can have another cup of mine, Hughes." "Thank you, sir. But another day, be a good idea to bring your own thermos. Always be as independent of other people as you can. That's another mark of a good copper." "I'll bring my own next time," the sergeant mumbled. "Be best. Of course, you have to plan your coffee intake when you're on a stakeout. Don't want to be needing a whittle at that vital moment when you have to move in like lightning, do you?" "No," said Sergeant Hughes, welcoming the variety. Then, emboldened by the change of monosyllable, he ventured a question. "Can you tell me a bit more about why we're actually doing this stakeout, sir?" "Well, I could," the inspector replied, tapping his nose slowly with the forefinger. "But whether I will or not is another matter. When I'm on a case, I always operate on a need-to-know basis. And what I have to ask myself in this instance is, how much do you need to know? I'd have thought the more I knew, the better it would be. In what way? Then we could discuss the information we have. We could have the benefit of each other's input." Input. Inspector Wilkinson enunciated the word with distaste. "When I want your input, Hughes, I will ask for it. Anyway, that hasn't really answered my question about how much you need to know." "To put it at its most basic," said the sergeant with a note of exasperation in his voice, "if I don't know what we're looking for in this surveillance, then I'm not going to